Good morning. With Super Tuesday right around the corner, we still have a very tight race for the 2016 presidential nomination. Though the field has shrunk considerably, we still have a crowded field of candidates. There's still quite the battle going on between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and the Republican field has narrowed from 21 to 6 in the past few weeks, with Donald Trump still leading the polls. Although the nominating conventions will not take place till this summer, these candidates have their work cut out for them. This isn't just because of the simple truth that only one person can receive the nomination, but also because this is an election like no other. Historically speaking, people often vote for someone because they think they are trustworthy or could imagine going to dinner with them and having a conversation. We elect candidates based on their characteristics of honesty, likability, and relatability. While this is all nice and clean, it's not the best way to make a decision about who to vote for. It is important to understand the platforms and beliefs of a candidate and select accordingly. In this election alone, we have seen more people misunderstand a candidate's platform and not have any idea what he or she believes in. There is no doubt that voter turnout this coming November is going to be high, but that doesn't always mean that the electorate is informed. Today, Mr. Hawes and Mr. Clifford are going to explain to you some of the basic platforms that have been hot topics during the many presidential debates, hoping to clear up any confusion. After each presentation, there will be time for a Q&A. Mr. Hawes is going to start first talking about foreign relations.
Good morning. All right, so the important thing is with foreign policy is that you can have policies and you can have plans, but the world often has its own plans. So I think the way to actually begin is to look at the sort of two main camps, hegemons and multilateralists. That these are the two basic philosophies that inform foreign policy decisions. And the hegemons believe America is the greatest country on earth. A lot of this greatness comes from its extraordinary military strength. America must act alone when necessary to pursue its interests. And this is roughly the foreign policy of the Republican Party, especially now that Rand Paul has dropped out of the race. He was the one who was perhaps different in his approach to foreign policy. Interestingly, at the debate this past Saturday, Donald Trump really, he has to this point been remarkably free-flowing in his embrace of Republican positions, but he actually in many ways criticized George W. Bush, perhaps as a way of going after his brother Jeb, for the decision to go into Iraq, and even for 9/11, which was something that tends not to be spoken about a lot in Republican circles. And South Carolina is a heavily veteran and military-oriented state, so it'll be interesting to see if that hurts him in South Carolina, breaking with the party orthodoxy on these issues. Multilateralists, that America's part of a community of nations, that we have since World War II created a number of international structures, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, NATO, and that America must lead where persuasion where it can, enforce only when it has to. Obviously, if you're looking at this, from what he said, Bernie Sanders is probably the most extreme version of multilateralism in the campaign. Clinton is probably closer to the middle than Obama is, for instance. She tends to be a little more hawkish. So what are the main areas and issues that the next president will be tested with, as we know right now? Because at the moment, we simply have no idea what's going to happen in 2 years, 1 year, 6 months, much less 5 or 8. The Middle East is in a period of extraordinary transition, and this transition is violent and chaotic. As you can see here on the map, and down there, those dark green areas represent Shia majority areas. The lighter green areas, excuse me, do I have that backwards? I can't really see the map. Okay, so the lighter green areas are predominantly Sunni, and they're more Sunni than Shia Muslims in the world, but the Shia are typically concentrated here around Iran and Iraq, and to a certain degree over here in Lebanon, and then down in Yemen. All these areas are riven by what's called a sectarian war between the Iran axis, which includes Iraq and the Assad regime in Syria, and the Saudi bloc, which includes Jordan, some of the resistance fighters there, the civil war in Yemen. And right now it's been a proxy war. It's probably best not to think of this as a religious war. It is a political war, a struggle for the Middle East that has religious overtones. ISIS came out of this civil war, and it began with the Iraq War. The Iraq War began by removing the Sunni leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and replacing him with a Shia parliament and a prime minister. Since that time, Iraq is basically fractured between the Sunni areas and the Shia areas, and the massive amounts of refugees that flooded into Syria have destabilized that country. That's what we're seeing now. ISIS also, as we'll see in a minute, is a global issue, which we'll talk about when we get there. Russia has been really damaged in the last 2 or 3 years by its own actions, the invasion of Ukraine in particular, and the falling prices of international commodities, especially oil. They base a lot of their budget and their power off their. They have they have the most extreme resource-based economy in many ways in the world. However, Vladimir Putin does not have the same sort of accountability. He can kind of do whatever he wants. With the international community, doesn't have a lot of influence on him. Russian citizens don't have a lot of influence on him. And so dealing with him, a guy who's basically unaccountable and very powerful economically and obviously militarily, is something that requires a great deal of finesse. It's fire. No, is that right? I don't know. China exists in a realm more of open questions. We're not quite sure what the questions will be in 5 years, but at the moment, what we're looking at is China's economy is beginning to cool. How will they respond? The Chinese regime's legitimacy is based on growth. Over the last 30 years, the Chinese economy has been the story in the global economy. That's slowing down. What will that mean for the Chinese citizens? And how will Chinese citizens respond to the government, which is authoritarian and repressive in many ways, now that they're not getting the economic growth? Will China have to behave like Russia, which is pushing its problems outward into places like Ukraine and Syria? And can America coexist with a rising China? Since around 1991, America has been, in the words of a French political scientist, a hyperpower. Increasingly now, with the rise of China, the re-rise of Russia, the rise of the European Union, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, it's a multipolar world. How will America negotiate that? Latin America. This is the near abroad. This is the area that America's traditionally been very heavily invested in. Mexico is, in the last 15 years, has made a transition to a more democratic form of government, but it's a country being torn apart by violence. Venezuela is in a massive economic and governmental crisis that has significant implications for the entire Caribbean basin. Recently, the Obama administration has opened up to Cuba for the first time in 50, 60 years. What will the impact of that be? Will that continue or will that end? Central America, particularly Guatemala and Honduras, have some of the highest murder rates in the world. That's touched off a refugee crisis, which was in the news, I think, this past summer, of particularly children as young as 11 and 12 years old, making it all the way, as a drug route, but all the way from here to there by themselves to come across the border into the United States. And then the issue with Brazil is yet another rising country, one that seeks to have a great deal of influence in Latin America. And then obviously there's global issues as well. There was recently a global climate change agreement. Typically speaking, that's a multilateralist thing. Together, all the countries will get together and address this issue. So it's not surprising that on the Democratic side, that's agreed upon, whereas on the Republican side, we're going to do our own thing. Disease. Ebola was never that big a deal really for us. The Zika virus, which is already in the United States, these issues, as people move around quickly, and actually as the globe warms, diseases can spread via, particularly insect vector diseases can spread. That requires a global response. Terrorism. ISIS is interesting. ISIS is not Al-Qaeda. It did arise out of Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda was centrally planned, and then they would franchise. Sometimes they were referred to as the McDonald's of terrorism. I think ISIS is more the YouTube, in the sense that it is user-generated. What happened in Paris, and particularly what happened in San Bernardino, wasn't planned by ISIS. They just take credit for it. They host it, and they host it on their website oftentimes. Drug trafficking, financial markets, all these issues, as the world changes, and changes at breakneck speed, what will this mean for the next president? And so, as Ms. Valenti said, where's their judgment, where's their experience? I would say for experience, on the Republican side, Marco Rubio serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That makes him probably, at this point, the most experienced foreign policy candidate. And then obviously on the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton was a First Lady, Senate Foreign Relations, and Secretary of State. So in those, that would be the resume part. And I guess at this point, I would open it up to questions. If you have any questions at all, let Ms. Valenti know, and I'll see if I can answer them. It's just like class. Told you it was just like class. Kayla, put her hand up.
Mr. Hawes, who do you think is the most qualified presidential candidate in terms of foreign policy?
Well, as I said, certainly if you're looking at resume, Clinton's resume is one of the more impressive foreign policy resumes of a presidential candidate. I think actually since James Monroe, in terms of the breadth of her experience. What Bernie Sanders has raised is her judgment that she voted for the Iraq War back in 2002-3. That becomes, and Libya to a certain degree, she was a forceful advocate for us going into Libya, which worked short term. Gaddafi fell, a humanitarian crisis in Benghazi and I can't remember the other place was averted. On the other hand, Libya is an absolute mess right now. So certainly experience-wise, she trumps the field, if you will. There's most of the compelling candidates at the moment on the Republican side either have no foreign policy experience in Trump's case, or the governors, Kasich and Bush. Bush would obviously have the ability to rely on his sort of family, his father and his brother's foreign policy apparatus, and many of those people surround him. So if he should somehow survive and become the establishment candidate as opposed to Rubio or Kasich or others, then he might put forward that as being his trump card. I know more about foreign policy than Donald Trump or Ted Cruz.
Coach Hawes, if you were president of the United States, what would you do to resolve the drug trafficking issue and a lot of the violence that comes from it in the Latin America area?
So the Mexican response is pretty logical, which is the drug war in Mexico is a product of American demand. And actually, if you look at the chart of the drug trafficking, this is stuff coming from overseas and up from Latin America, and much of that's heroin. And the heroin and opiate epidemic in the United States is suddenly everybody's talking about it. And one of the reasons everyone's talking about it is it is potentially, and not potentially, it is lethal. People tend to start on prescription drugs. They no longer have access to OxyContin and things like that, so they switch to a cheaper, bigger high in heroin, and oftentimes that can lead to overdose and death. There's some interesting, I would say the primary thing as president you could do would be to address the demand side. There are drugs you can take that makes it very difficult to take opiates. They give you a violent reaction, you throw up. There is obviously the legalization argument for marijuana. I don't know how much of marijuana is the cause of the drug violence in Mexico. and how much of it is typically more heroin and cocaine. But that's one of the proponents of legalization, is you get rid of a black market, you get rid of, I don't think that's something a president will be able to accomplish. So primarily, addressing the opiate demand in this country would probably be the best thing you could do. Aside from that, the United States does have a pretty close relationship with Mexico on this issue. We work closely together. I think the DEA was there when they recaptured El Chapo, for instance, stuff like that.
Question over
here. In the Republican debate, Jeb Bush brought up his brother as also the platform of his foreign policy. Do you think that his brother will be an asset or a liability in his campaign?
That was what was so interesting about what Trump said, because Trump went right after his brother. And typically speaking, that would be the end of Donald Trump. But as we've seen over the past year, every time he does something that would end any other mortal candidate's campaign, his poll numbers go up. So it's very difficult to know what effect it will have in the Republican primary. I think to a certain degree, you attack George W. Bush, that's going to make the party elite very uncomfortable, but they're already uncomfortable with him. So what effect does it have on the sort of voter who's been supporting Donald Trump, which is typically working class, high school degree, economically probably feels pretty nervous. That's part of his appeal. And also probably, unlike the party elites, know people who went to Iraq and weren't, maybe they're waiting for someone to say, yeah, that was a mistake. Most people, I think, even in the Republican establishment, would say the Iraq War was probably not the best choice. So attacking that, it'll be interesting to see. In South Carolina, it will be a perfect bellwether. If Trump attacks George W. Bush and still wins the state by 10 points, then clearly having the Bush last name is not going to be an asset for Jeb Bush. And it hasn't been to this point, so I can't see that changing.
Why is it that Hillary Clinton has, on paper, more experience internationally, but it's Bernie Sanders that keeps mentioning what a lot of other countries are doing better? It seems like he's much more aware of how they work more than Hillary talks about.
Yeah, what Sanders is doing is trying to import a Scandinavian social democratic model. So he's going to point to those countries as being successful in various ways, because that's his evidence that this will work. That's not quite the same thing as foreign policy, because that's not our interaction with Scandinavia. So his drawing in of the Denmark as his favorite example is really more him justifying his domestic economic programs. The one thing he does continue to hit her on, and will continue to hit her on, is the Iraq War vote. That's the moment he says where my judgment was good and yours was bad. Should we actually?
At this point, we're going to move on. If you have more questions about foreign policy, shoot an email to Mr. Hawes, and he'll respond. Thank you.
Okay, so this is basically AP economics, but for 600 people instead of 20. So if this works, this could be a whole new way of actually running this class. I'm kind of excited to test this out. And by the way, if you hate the next 15 minutes, don't take AP Econ next year. You will not find it a good experience. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the economics issues in this election, and talk about at least some of the leading candidates and some of their basic positions on the economy to kind of inform you about what's going on in that regard. So there's two big policy areas within economics that affect most presidential elections. So one is awareness of the budget deficit that the country faces and the national debt. And the other is tax policy, which is often a place where candidates kind of show their different points of view and different ideologies as opposed to how they would propose collecting revenue from the public. So let's take a look at those things. Okay, so we actually have a question here. This requires some participation from you, all right? So budget deficits occur when the government spends more than it takes in, right? Pretty basic idea. Now, over the last 35 years, so roughly since 1980 when Reagan got elected, all right, I want you to think about, I want you to guess how many times we have run a budget deficit in that 35-year period. And I've made it a multiple choice question for you. And we're gonna vote on this by applause. So let's look at the choices. So we have less than 10 times, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, or the extreme case, we've run 30 or more budget deficits in 35 years, okay? So we're gonna do this by applause-o-meter. How many people vote for A? We have run less than 10 budget deficits in that period of time. Anybody? That was like one single clap. That's very low on the applause-o-meter. How about 10 to 19? Yeah, okay. That would be kind of like, you know, roughly half the time, maybe a little less than half the time, okay? How about 20 to 29? Okay, so we're a little pessimistic there. That would be less, most of the time running, but how about anyone go to extreme 30 or more times? Yeah, so this is a case where the wisdom of the crowds is in fact correct. So in the last 35 years, we have run 31 budget deficits. The only period of time, let's actually take a peek at the graph. So this graph takes some explanation. The y-axis here is the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, which is basically the size of the overall economy. And so anytime it's negative, so below this black line, we have run a deficit. And anytime it's above that black line, we have run a budget surplus, all right? So you can see that over this entire period of time, we have almost always run a budget deficit, all right? There was one brief moment in the late 90s to early 2000 where we ran a surplus for several years in a row, okay? Quite interesting in that this was the end of the Clinton administration, so we had a Democratic president, but we had a Republican-controlled Congress, all right? John Kasich, who was one of the Republican candidates, was actually the head of the House Budget Committee during that period of time and is sort of promoting that as one of his platform pieces of his campaign. So in a mixed government, Democratic president and Republican legislature, we actually did manage to run a small budgetary surplus. But I will point out, this was during the dot-com boom, so one of the biggest economic upturns in recent memory, which founded many of the foundational internet companies like eBay and Amazon that we still talk about today. So all of that sort of developed in this time period. So you have exceptional economic growth, and you have a small period where we actually ran a balanced, and in fact, we ran a small surplus in the government. But every other year in this period, we ran a deficit. And the story doesn't change if you go back. We did not run a single surplus in the 70s either, nor did we run one in much of the 60s. So whether you have a government controlled by the Republicans, by the Democrats, you have a time of plenty, you have a time of recession, our government almost always runs a budget deficit. Okay, and that's one of the things that you need to be aware of as a voter and think about how will any future government handle that. Okay. So when you run budget deficits all the time, okay, you're always falling a little bit short. Over time, all of those deficits from year to year accumulate into what we call the national debt, all right? So our national debt currently stands at over $18 trillion, okay? That represents past cases where we spent more than we took in, and we had to borrow from somebody in order to pay our bills, okay? And typically we borrow from citizens who have extra money and loan it to the government by buying treasury bonds, foreign governments and foreign citizens, okay? And so the US in total is in debt $18 trillion to a variety of both public and private entities. Okay, here's a graph of what the national debt looks over time. And again, the y-axis in this case, it's measured as a percentage of the total annual economy. So if you go back in time, all right, after World War II, the national debt tended to be in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the total economy in a given year. When Reagan took office in the 80s, we cut taxes and increased our spending on defense, which helped us in some ways win the Cold War. But a consequence of that was a big increase in the federal deficits during that time and a large amount of growth in the overall level of government debt. We had a period here where it was relatively stable, but then with the big economic crisis in 2007, 2008, and financing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we once again saw a very large increase in the government debt, and it is now ballooned to where the debt of the nation is roughly equal to our total annual economic output in 1 year. Okay, so the entire GDP of the US economy is roughly the same as our national debt of $18 trillion, all right? So what that means, if you think about this as you as a younger voter or soon-to-be voter, past spending by our governments has basically taken money from your generation and spent it in the current generation, and now leaves you with the debt in the future, which would imply that sometime down the road, we will either have to spend less as a government, or we will have to raise taxes in order to pay down our debt. So one thing is, you look at some of the economic proposals of the different candidates, you want to give some mind to, knowing that we have a big national debt already and that we frequently run budget deficits, what kinds of proposals that the candidates are putting out there are either going to help the situation that we're in or potentially make it worse. And that's something you need to think about. Okay. The second piece that I said I was going to talk about is tax policy, all right? So I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview of a very complex issue. So in the United States, we have what economists refer to as a progressive tax system, okay? And that's the basic idea that the more you make, the higher rate of taxes you pay, all right? That's the basic idea in a progressive tax system. We currently have 7 tax brackets, and the highest rate that you can pay on income tax is about 40% if you are an individual that makes above $415,000 or a family that makes over about $465,000, okay? Income that you make on investing is taxed at a lower rate in our society. That's the capital gains tax, okay? And then there are all variety of deductions and credits and special laws that affect the actual amount of tax that most people have to pay. Our system is quite complicated to comply with and to understand. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some of the individual candidates' positions and kind of highlight not everything that they have as for economic proposals, but at least some of the big issues, and you can get an idea of where they stand and how that might affect some of the things in terms of tax policy or the government deficit that we've already mentioned. Okay, so Hillary Clinton is the first one. She's the current Democratic frontrunner. All right, her economic proposals are in some ways a little bit more modest, not as big a departure from what we currently do with some of the other candidates. So one of her big initiatives is a $350 billion, what she's describing as a new college compact that would strive to make community college free for students to enroll in, reduce the amount of loan payments that are required in financial aid if you go to a state school, and also reduce the interest rate that most people pay on their student loans. That would be a fairly expensive undertaking. The estimate is about $350 billion over a 10-year period. And the basic way that she proposes to fund this initiative and a number of others would be putting on a surcharge of an additional 4% tax on all forms of income that exceed $5 million, all right? There's not that many individuals who actually have an income of that greater level, so this would be a policy that affects relatively few people, but those people it does affect, it would certainly be an uptick in their taxes, okay? Other significant Clinton initiatives, a tax credit for companies that share profits with workers, and Hillary Clinton is in favor of raising the federal minimum wage up to a $12 level, okay? So those are some basic Hillary Clinton ideas. Okay, so next I'll do the Republican frontrunner, Donald Trump, okay? So Trump would like to see us simplify the tax code, and he has proposed a move to go to 4 tax brackets, all right? In the bottom bracket, if you are an individual under 25K or a family that makes less than 50, you'd pay no income tax at all under his basic plan. And he would set the highest rate at 25% for individuals who earn more than 150,000 or families over 300,000. He would also advocate lowering the capital gains tax to 20%. Now, you notice that we already run a budget deficit, and his proposal would cut tax rates generally across the board for everyone. He claims that he can get some of that money back by eliminating a wide variety of deductions and loopholes that are currently present in the system. Although I think, to be fair, most people who have looked at his tax plan would still feel that it would reduce the total amount of revenue taken into the government, and since we're already running a deficit, it would likely make any deficit we have worse. A few other things: reducing rate of taxes on corporations, elimination of the estate tax for when people pass away and hand over assets to their children. He would propose eliminating the tax on that. And then one other piece that overlaps a little with foreign policy: he would like us to renegotiate some of our trade dealings, particularly with the Chinese. That's something he has talked about a lot in his campaign. Okay, we'll go back to the Democrats. So now we'll talk about 2 more extreme types of proposals. First, we'll look at Sanders, and then we'll look at Ted Cruz. Sanders would like to make a variety of pretty significant moves that would, as Mr. Hawes said, move the United States closer to some of the socialist democracies in terms of their style of taxation and government services. So that would include a significant increase of the minimum wage to $15 per hour, a large infrastructure project on the order of $1 trillion for rebuilding roads and bridges and things of that nature, making tuition free at public colleges, expansion of Medicare such that it provided a single-payer health care system to all citizens, right? That would be a very expensive and massive undertaking, and you can see how difficult it was to get the more marginal and smaller scale Obamacare instituted. So that would be a pretty big change. And then Sanders would like to see a reversal of some of the recent international trade agreements where he believes America has kind of given up too much to other countries in negotiating those deals. Now, as you can imagine, all of those things would be extraordinarily expensive to execute, and Sanders is well aware of that. So he has been fairly clear that he intends to pay for that with some significant increases in taxation. So taxing overseas profits from corporations, increasing payroll taxes on both employers and employees, taxing financial trades executed by investment banks, increasing the estate tax as opposed to eliminating it like most of the Republicans would like to do, lowering the capital gains tax benefit, and introducing some higher tax brackets all the way up to a marginal rate of 52% on people's incomes that exceed $10 million, all right? So this is a very liberal, progressive type of approach where you are substantially increasing government services, but you are also increasing taxes in order to pay for all of those additional services. Okay, and then finally, Ted Cruz, another one of the front-running Republican candidates. He's this year's version of the flat tax candidate. So his baseline proposal will be a 10% tax that is applied evenly to all taxpayers, whether you are lower income or wealthier, although there would be a certain starting exemption on the order of a certain amount per family member. So he estimated a $36,000 tax-free amount for a family of 4. He would like to pay for that massive cut in the tax rate by reducing many of the current deductions that are currently out there. And this is a big thing that a lot of people don't understand very well. You notice that even some of the other Republicans who would like to cut taxes are talking about top tax rates in the neighborhood of 25, 28%. So you might wonder, how could we possibly fund the government by dropping the top tax rate down to 10% for everyone? All right. His proposal also includes a pretty significant change in the way we do taxation, which would be imposing a 16% value-added tax on all business activity. So his proposal would actually change the biggest source of tax revenue coming from individual citizens to businesses actually generating most of the taxes. That's a fairly complicated issue. There's a lot of differences in the way we do things now that this would be a fairly big departure from. But that is one of his key proposals. He would be in favor of eliminating the estate tax, and he would also be in favor of repealing Obamacare and its various associated taxes. Okay? All right, so that's the end of the really quick overview of the candidates' positions. So now we can take more questions if you have them on the economic side, or I suppose even if you wanted to go back and ask Hawes any more foreign policy questions.
Hi, I actually do have a question for Mr. Hawes.
Darn it!
Mr. Hawes, what do you think the U.S.'s response should be to the Syrian refugee crisis?
That's a very complicated question. Obviously, it's primarily a European question. And unfortunately, there's so many things that's caught up in the campaign. A lot of the energy, which actually does apply a little bit to the economic stuff, is that sense of economic dislocation makes people very reluctant to take in refugees. That's true in Europe. That's true here. Obviously, the fact that it's coming from a war zone, the attacks in Paris were a shock in many ways. There was also some issues in Cologne, Germany, with some a sexual assault. It's very complicated. I don't know if that's a multilateral approach is simply this is primarily Europe's issue because of proximity, just as things in Mexico is primarily our concern. So I would say there's not a lot we could do, and yet we're still probably not doing enough, if that makes any sense.
For Mr. Clifford, which candidate do you think has the most realistic economic plan, like that could be implemented during their time in office if they were to?
Yeah, I would say Hillary Clinton's plan is probably the least departure from the kinds of things that we're already doing. So it's more incremental in that it doesn't propose tons of new spending, at least so far, and it doesn't propose tons of new taxes either. So that would be the one that I would say of the major candidates is a fairly incremental approach. On the Republican side, John Kasich's stuff is also fairly incremental in nature, and given his past experience as a House budget director, you'd probably expect him to have a more sensible plan and more realistic plan than some of the other guys. Most of the front-running Republican plans, at least so far, look like they won't generate enough revenue. So unless they're accompanied by significant cuts in spending, they would most likely increase the size of the budget deficit.
Mr. Clifford?
Yep.
So Donald Trump says that he will put a 35% tariff on companies that migrate their operations from U.S. to Mexico. Do you think Donald Trump knows what the North American Free Trade Agreement is? Is he making these up because he cannot arbitrarily increase tariffs according to NAFTA?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that really falls into the category of proposals for him that at the moment don't have a lot of grounding. They sound good and they may appeal to some of his constituents, but don't really have a firm basis in sort of legal or economic reality at this point.
Thanks so much for paying attention. If you have more questions, shoot an email to either Mr. Clifford or Mr. Hawes. Let's give him a round of applause.